The room went silent the moment he walked in. Not the polite kind of silence that falls when someone important enters. This was the other kind, the kind that comes from fear, from instinct, from something ancient in the human body that recognizes danger before the mind can name it. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every glass paused halfway to every mouth. Even the music seemed to lower itself, as if the speakers understood that his presence demanded submission. Damien Voss did not look around the room. He never did. He walked in the way a man walks into a space he owns, not because he bought it, but because the air itself had already decided to belong to him. Dark suit, no tie, a jaw that could have been carved from the same cold marble as the floors beneath his shoes. He moved toward the center of the hall without hurrying, and the crowd parted for him like water parts for a blade. The charity gala had been in full swing for over an hour. 300 of the city's most powerful people, politicians, businessmen, heirs to old fortunes, all gathered in the crystal-lit ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, all performing their versions of generosity for the cameras. It was theater, everyone knew it, but tonight something had shifted. Tonight there was a debt being collected. His men spread out behind him, quiet and enormous, their eyes moving across the room with professional stillness. No one from the outside would have noticed them, but everyone inside already knew. The whispers had started the moment the black SUV had pulled up outside. He's here, he's actually here. And now those whispers had died completely, replaced by the much louder sound of held breath. Marco Bellini stood near the far bar, his champagne flute trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand. 53 years old, city treasurer, a man who had, until approximately 48 hours ago, believed himself untouchable. He was watching Damien cross the room with the expression of a man watching his own verdict being read. Damien stopped 5 feet from him. He said nothing. He simply looked at him, and somehow that was worse than anything he could have said. Mr. Voss, Marco set his glass down carefully on the bar behind him, the way a man sets down something he's afraid he might drop. I wasn't expecting you tonight. I know, Damien said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing about him that people always underestimated until it was too late. He never raised it. He never needed to. The silence stretched. Marco's hand moved to his collar. The funds will be 3 days, Damien said. Just that, 2 words, a door closing. Marco nodded. Something behind his eyes went out. And then Damien turned away from him, already done, already somewhere else in his mind. And that was the moment she stepped directly into his path. She was carrying a notebook, not a clutch, not a crystal, encrusted evening bag like every other woman in that room. A plain, dark, covered spiral notebook, pressed against her chest with both arms, like it was the most important thing in the building. She was wearing a deep navy dress, simple, unadorned, elegant in the way that required no effort, and her dark hair was pinned back in a way that suggested she had done it herself, quickly in back of a cab. She was not looking at him. She was looking down at something she'd written, her lips moving slightly as she read, walking with the focused, slightly distracted energy of someone who existed in their own world and had temporarily been placed in this one by accident. She walked directly into his chest. The notebook fell. The entire room watched it happen. The entire room watched her stumble back half a step, watched the notebook hit the marble floor with a flat, undramatic sound, watched her look up, finally, fully, and find Damien Voss staring down at her with an expression that was not anger, exactly, but something close enough to it that most people in that room would have been apologizing before their mouths finished opening. She was not most people. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, then she crouched down and picked up her notebook. When she straightened, she looked at him again, and what was in her eyes was not fear, and it was not apology, and it was not the particular species of flustered embarrassment that beautiful women in rooms like this usually performed when they made a mistake near a powerful man. It was something quieter than all of those things. Something almost steady. I wasn't watching where I was going, she said. I'm sorry. The room waited for something terrible to happen. Damien looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. His eyes moved, just once, to the notebook in her hands. Then back to her face. He said nothing. He walked past her. She watched him go. Then she opened her notebook and found her page again. Nobody in that room understood what they had just witnessed. But something in the air had changed, something small and indefinable, like the first hair. Thin crack in a wall that everyone had assumed was solid. Her name was Alara Vance, and she was not supposed to be at this gala. She was there because her editor had called her at 6:15 that evening and told her that the journalist originally assigned to cover the event had food poisoning, that they needed someone in that room tonight, and that she was the only person in the office who still had a formal dress in their locker from the last company event. It was not a glamorous origin story, but Alara had learned a long time ago that most things that mattered arrived without warning and without ceremony. She was 26. She worked for a mid-sized city paper called the Meridian Courier, which was neither prestigious nor embarrassing. It was simply the place that had hired her 4 years ago when she'd walked in with a portfolio of freelance pieces and the specific kind of quiet determination that made certain editors pay attention. She covered human interest stories mostly, the kind of stories that didn't win awards, but that people clipped out and put on their refrigerators and sent to their mothers. She was good at finding the thing inside a thing, the real story beneath the official one, the emotion living underneath the facts. Tonight, she had been sent to cover the gala's charitable component. The donations, the speeches, the performative generosity of the city's elite. She had not been briefed on the other thing happening in that room. She had not known that Damien Voss would be there. Almost no one, outside certain circles, knew what Damien Voss actually was. What the city saw, what the newspapers reported, what the official record contained, was the clean version, founder of Voss Capital, one of the largest private investment firms in the region. Philanthropist, board member of several reputable institutions, 34 years old, unmarried, a man of considerable wealth and considerable privacy. Photographs of him were rare. Interviews were essentially non-existent. He was the kind of powerful that had learned long ago that visibility was a liability. What the city did not see was the other structure beneath the visible one. The network of arrangements and enforced loyalties and quiet threats that kept certain things running smoothly in this city, the things that official channels preferred not to examine too closely. Damien Voss was not the kind of man whose power came only from money. It came from something older than that, something that his grandfather had built from nothing in a city that had not yet learned to ask questions, and that his father had refined, and that Damien himself had made into something so seamlessly integrated into the legitimate world that the line between the two had long since blurred into something nearly invisible. Nearly, Alara did not know any of this, not yet. What she knew as she found a quiet corner near the back of the hall and opened her notebook was that the man she had walked into had looked at her with eyes that were the particular color of winter water, gray, green and deep and absolutely still, and that something in those eyes had been, for just a fraction of a second, something she had not expected to see in a face like that. Curiosity. She pushed the thought aside and started writing. Across the room, Damien stood near the tall windows that overlooked the city below. A glass of something amber held loosely in one hand that he had not drunk from. His second, Marcus, was beside him. A compact, watchful man named Reyes, who had been with him for 11 years and who communicated entire conversations in silence. The girl with the notebook, Damien said, not a question. Press, Reyes said quietly. Meridian Courier. They sent someone last minute apparently. She's a features writer. Human interest. Damien said nothing for a moment. Below them, the city glittered in the October dark, indifferent and continuous. She's not the threat, Reyes said. I know she's not the threat. Damien said. Another silence. Reyes did not ask the obvious question. That was why he had lasted 11 years. Damien watched the room. He watched Bellini refill his champagne with slightly shaking hands. He watched the deputy mayor Glad, handing near the donation table with the practiced warmth of a man who had been performing it for so long he'd forgotten it was a performance. He watched the city's machinery run, and he was part of it, and it ran because he was part of it, and there was nothing about this evening that should have felt different from any other evening. He did not look back toward the corner, where a woman in a navy dress was writing in a notebook by herself. He didn't need to. He already knew exactly where she was. The speeches began at 9. Alara stood near the side wall, notebook open, pen moving. She had a particular way of taking notes, not shorthand exactly, but a private system she developed over years, half words and half symbols and lines that connected ideas that didn't yet know they were connected. She was listening to the deputy mayor speak about community development with the particular half attention of a journalist who had heard many speeches and was mostly listening for the single sentence that would mean something. She had not thought again about the man she'd collided with, or rather, she had tried not to, which was not quite the same thing. There was something about the way he had looked at her notebook, not at her at the notebook, like it had surprised him, like he had expected her to be carrying something else, or nothing at all, and the notebook had registered as something briefly, puzzlingly real. She didn't know why she'd noticed that. She was usually good at setting aside things that didn't belong in the story she was working on. You shouldn't stand so close to the wall. She turned. One of the large, quiet men, one of his, was standing beside her. Not close enough to crowd her, just close enough to be clearly deliberate. "Mr. Voss would like to speak with you," the man said. His face was entirely neutral. When you have a moment, Alara looked at him for a beat. "Who is Mr. Voss?" The man blinked. It was the only time his composure moved. "He, the gentleman you near the entrance earlier." "Ah." She looked back at the stage, where the deputy mayor was reaching the crescendo of his remarks. "I'm working right now." The man stared at her. "Tell him I'll find him after the speeches," she said, and wrote something in her notebook. The man went back. Alara did not watch to see what happened when he delivered this message. She was fairly certain, in a distant, professional way, that she should probably have been more concerned about the situation than she was. But she had been sent here to do a job, and the speeches were not going to cover themselves. Behind her, had she turned, she would have seen something happen on Damien Voss's face that almost no one in this city had ever seen. Something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. She found him after the speeches, which had lasted 40 minutes longer than anyone had wanted them to. The crowd was looser now, the champagne having done its work, the formal portion of the evening dissolving into something more like a party. Alara moved through it with the practiced ease of someone used to being at events where she didn't belong, notebook tucked under her arm, looking for the man she'd apparently agreed to speak with. She found him, or rather he found her, which, given the geography of the room, was probably always how it was going to go. He was standing near the far end of the hall, slightly apart from the cluster of people who were orbiting his general location without quite approaching him, the way satellites orbit a planet they're both drawn toward and afraid of. "You told my man you were working," he said when she stopped in front of him. "No greeting, no preamble, I was," she said, "and now I'm on a break." She met his eyes directly. Up close, they were more complex than she'd thought. There were layers in them, like deep water. "You wanted to speak with me." He looked at her for a moment. Then, almost as if the words cost him something, "What are you writing?" Alara paused. Out of all the things she had imagined him saying, a warning, maybe, or an inquiry into her press credentials, or the particular kind of subtle intimidation that men in expensive rooms sometimes deployed when they noticed a journalist, she had not expected that. Tonight, notes on the gala, the charitable component, the donors, in general, he said. "The notebook? You were reading it before. You were writing in it during the speeches. What are you writing?" She studied him for a moment. "Why does that matter to you?" "It doesn't," he said, and then, quietly, with the slight edge of someone who is not accustomed to correcting themselves, "I'm asking anyway." The noise of the party continued around them. Someone laughed too loudly near the bar. A photographer's flash went off across the room. Stories, Alara said. Finally, I'm always writing stories. About what? About people. She tilted her head slightly. About the things they carry. The silence that fell between them lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt longer than that. It felt like the particular kind of silence that arrives when two people simultaneously recognize something they weren't expecting to find. Damien looked at the notebook again, then away, out over the room. Be careful which people you write about in this city, he said. His voice was completely level. Some of them don't like to be seen. It was a warning. It was possibly also something else. She wasn't sure, is that a threat, she asked. It's an observation. They often look the same. He turned back to look at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not much, barely a degree, but she felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure in your chest before you hear the thunder. Your name, he said. You could ask your man to find it, she said. He seemed very capable. I'm asking you. A beat. Alara Vance. He said nothing. He didn't repeat it, didn't nod, didn't do any of the things people normally do when they receive a piece of information. He just held it in that still way of his, like he was placing it somewhere specific inside himself. Good night, Ms. Vance, he said. He turned and walked away, and the crowd moved to accommodate him without being asked, and Alara stood where he'd left her, pen hovering over her open notebook, staring at the space where he had been. She wrote one line, then she closed the notebook. She did not write about him that night. This was unusual for Alara. Her process developed over 4 years of journalism and a lifetime of quiet observation, was to write everything down immediately, every detail, every impression, every word exchanged before the texture of a moment faded into the smooth, unreliable surface of memory. She wrote about the gala, filling 2.5 pages with notes on the speeches, the donors, the careful theater of public generosity. She wrote about Marco Bellin, his trembling hand on his champagne flute, which she had noticed but not yet understood. She wrote about the deputy mayor's practiced warmth and the way his eyes had gone briefly, tellingly cold when the cameras turned away. She did not write about winter, water eyes, or the specific quality of a silence that felt like a held breath. She told herself this was professional discipline. She told herself he was not part of the story she had been sent to cover. She told herself the warning he had given her, some of them don't like to be seen, was standard. Issue intimidation from a man who was accustomed to controlling what got written about his city, and that she had encountered versions of it before, and would encounter versions of it again. And there was nothing particular or notable about this one. She was lying to herself. She was aware that she was lying to herself. She made a separate peace with this and went to bed. She dreamed about a door that kept opening onto rooms she hadn't expected. 3 days later, her editor called her into his office and told her the story had changed. Gerald Marsh was 61 years old, built like a former rugby player gone partially to seed, and possessed of the specific kind of editorial instinct that could not be taught, the nose for the story beneath the story, the ear for the note that was slightly off, key. He had hired Alara 4 years ago because she had that same instinct, undeveloped but unmistakably present, and he had spent 4 years watching it sharpen into something he had not entirely expected. He closed the door, which he did not usually do. The Bellini piece, he said. What do you have? Alara looked up from her notebook. The treasurer. I have him at the gala, looking like a man who just received bad news. I have some background on the City Development Fund discrepancies from last quarter. Nothing confirmed yet. Why? Gerald sat down heavily in his chair. He had a particular way of doing this when he was about to say something he wasn't sure he should say. Someone reached out to me this morning, anonymous. They sent documentation, financial records, transfer logs, names. It's significant, Alara. If it's real, it's significant enough that I need someone I trust on it. What kind of names? He was quiet for a moment. The kind that make you careful about who you tell. She understood then, in the precise way she always understood things, not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing the next. Vos Capital, she said. Gerald looked at her, How did you? I was at the gala. She kept her voice even. Damien Voss came to collect something from Bellini. I didn't know what it was then. Gerald's expression did something complicated. You spoke to him, briefly. Alara. He leaned forward. His voice had dropped, which it did when he was genuinely worried rather than editorially worried. They were different registers, and she had learned to distinguish them years ago. If this documentation is what it appears to be, and if Voss Capital is connected to Bellini, is fund manipulations the way this source is suggesting, this is not a human interest story. This is not the kind of story you approach from the front. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You're telling me to be careful. I'm telling you that men like Damien Voss don't appear in stories. They make stories disappear. He held her gaze. I need you to decide, right now, whether you want this assignment. And I need you to understand that saying no is the sensible choice, and I will not think less of you for it. Alara looked down at her notebook. She thought, without meaning to, about Winter, water eyes. About the way he had said be careful which people you write about in this city. With that strange, level flatness, like a man reciting a law he had written himself. She thought about the thing her mother had told her, years ago, standing in the kitchen of their small apartment, voice quiet and certain as gravity. The story that scares you is always the one worth telling. Her mother had been dead for 2 years. The apartment was gone. The kitchen existed now only in the specific way that lost things exist, perfectly preserved, impossibly distant. A room you could describe in perfect detail, but never return to. I want the assignment, Alara said. Gerald nodded slowly. I was afraid of that. He slid a folder across the desk. Read this tonight. Tell no one, and Alara, keep your notebook close. She picked up the folder. She did not ask him why he'd said that last part. She already knew. It was the only thing she had that Damien Voss had seemed to notice. The only thing about her that had registered as real to a man who had clearly made a life out of looking through people rather than at them. She walked back to her desk. She opened the folder, and the story began to open like a wound. The documentation was meticulous. Someone had spent months, possibly longer, assembling it. Transfer records from the city's development fund cross, referenced with shell accounts that traced, through several layers of careful misdirection, back to subsidiary structures connected to Voss Capital. It was not simple embezzlement. It was more architecturally complex than that. A system of redirected municipal funds that had been quietly reinvested through private channels, generating returns that never appeared in any public record, the city's infrastructure money, moving in circles that ended, always in the same place. It was, in its way, almost elegant. Alara had covered enough financial stories to recognize the difference between crude theft and something that had been designed, something that had been built the way a master clockmaker builds a clock, each gear dependent on every other gear, the whole mechanism invisible to anyone who only looked at the face. She worked through the night. By 3 in the morning, she had filled 11 pages of her notebook with connections, questions, gaps in the chain. By 4, she had 2 names she hadn't started with. By 5, she was sitting at her kitchen table with cold coffee and the specific wide, awake exhaustion of a person who has found the edge of something enormous and is now standing on it. She closed the folder. She looked at what she had written. At the center of everything, at the still, quiet center of this entire architecture, was a name that appeared not in the documents themselves, but in the shape of what surrounded them. An absence that was itself a presence, a gravity that organized everything around it without being directly visible in any of it. She had not confirmed it yet. She would not write it yet, but she knew. She picked up her pen and wrote 1 sentence in the margin of her notebook, in her private shorthand that no one else could read. Then she closed it and sat with the silence of her apartment, and thought about a man who had asked her what she was writing with the quiet, unguarded intensity of someone who had genuinely wanted to know. She did not expect to see him again. This was a reasonable expectation in a city of this size, given that he moved in circles that were largely invisible to the world she inhabited. The charity gala had been an anomaly, his presence there a specific errand, not a social habit. She had gone back to her desk, her sources, her notebook. He had gone back to whatever world he actually occupied. The brief, strange collision in the marble hallway might as well have been a dream. Which was why, 12 days after the gala, when she walked into the reading room of the Meridian City Library at 7:30 in the morning, her usual habit, the quiet hour before the building officially opened, when the building manager let her in because she'd once written a piece about the library's funding crisis that had generated enough public response to restore the budget. Found Damien Voss sitting alone at the table in the far corner. She stopped walking entirely. He was reading. An actual book, hardcover, unmarked, held in both hands with the complete attention of someone for whom the room around them had temporarily ceased to exist. He had not heard her come in, or if he had not acknowledged it. He was wearing dark clothes, no jacket, the first time she had seen him without the full armor of the expensive suit. He looked, in the gray morning light of the reading room, unexpectedly human. She should have turned around. She knew this. Whatever calculation she had made that led her to not turn around, she made it in about 2 seconds, set down her bag at her usual table, and opened her notebook. He looked up 3 minutes later. The moment when his eyes found her across the room was like watching a current switch on. Not surprise exactly, or if it was surprise. It was the kind that had been processed so quickly, it had already become something else by the time it reached his face. His eyes held hers for a moment, then he looked back at his book. She looked back at her notebook. They sat like that for 22 minutes in the gray quiet of the library's reading room and said nothing, and the silence was so loaded it was almost audible, like a frequency just below the range of hearing. When he stood to leave, he stopped at her table. She did not look up. "You're here every morning," he said. It was not a question. "Most mornings," she said, still writing. "Why?" Now she looked up. "Because it's quiet. Because it's the only place in this city where no one is performing for anyone." She paused. "Why are you here?" He looked at her for a moment with that particular expression, the one that gave nothing away and somehow, because of that, gave everything away. "Same reason," he said. He left. The door closed behind him with the soft, definitive sound of a period at the end of a sentence. Elara sat very still. Then she wrote something in her notebook. Not about the documentation, not about Bellini, not about shell accounts or trance, for records. Something else. Something she immediately pressed her hand flat over, as if covering it could keep it from being true. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He never sat at her table. He never initiated conversation. He arrived, he read, he left, and each time on his way out, he stopped for exactly one exchange, brief and complete as a closed door. These exchanges had a quality that Elara, who spent her professional life listening to what people said and what they meant by it, found genuinely difficult to classify. They were not flirtatious. They were not adversarial. They were something else, something that felt like two people circling a subject they had both agreed, silently, not to name yet. On the third morning, "You write more than you read. I find more in people than in books." A pause. That sounds lonelier than it should. She had looked up then sharply, and he had already turned toward the door. On the fourth morning, he arrived to find her reading, actually reading, for once, a worn paperback she'd carried in her bag for 3 weeks, and said nothing at all. He sat down, he opened his book, and the silence that morning was different from the others, softer somehow, less pressurized, as if some agreement had been reached that neither of them had consciously made. On the fifth morning, she was not there. She was not there because she had spent the previous night at the hospital. She had not planned to tell anyone. She had, in fact, a long, established practice of not telling anyone, which she had developed in the 2 years since her mother's death and refined into something nearly airtight. She did not tell her colleagues. She did not tell Gerald, who would have understood but whom she did not want to worry. She handled it the way she handled most things, quietly, alone, with her notebook and her private shorthand and the particular competence that had always been both her greatest strength and most isolating thing about her. Her mother's medical debt had outlived her mother. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, a common and thoroughly unsexy tragedy that affected thousands of families in this city. and that Alara had written about with great care and appropriate journalistic distance before it had happened to her personally, and that she was now living with in the way you live with something you thought you understood and discover you did not understand it. All the amount was significant. Not unsurvivable, but significant, a constant low, grade pressure that shaped every financial decision she made, that determined which assignments she took and which ones she turned down, that explained, among other things, why she still had a formal dress in her office locker from a company event 3 years ago. She managed it. She had always managed it. Management was, in some ways, the entire architecture of her life. But last night the management had broken down in a specific way. A collections notice, a miscommunication with the hospital's billing department, a threatened escalation that she had spent 3 hours on the phone resolving. And by the time it was resolved, it was past midnight, and she was sitting on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her notebook in her lap. Not writing, just holding it. The way you hold something when you are trying to remember what solid feels like. She had not cried. She did not cry easily, and when she did it meant something, and she had decided a long time ago that she would not spend her one cry on a billing department. She had simply sat there, in the quiet of her kitchen, and felt the weight of the thing she carried, and then gotten up and gone to bed. In the morning, she was too tired for the library. She did not know, could not have known that across the city, Damien Voss had arrived at the reading room at 7:30, had sat down at his usual table, had opened his book, and had spent 40 minutes reading approximately 4 pages before he acknowledged to himself that he had not absorbed a single word of them. He had sat for another 10 minutes after that, in the quiet of the room, in the space where she was not, and felt something he did not have a clean word for and did not particularly want to examine. Then he had closed his book, stood up, and made a phone call. "Vance," he said when Reyes answered. "Ilara Vance, I want to know everything." Reyes delivered the file the following evening. It was not a thick file. Damien had not asked for surveillance, had not asked for anything invasive or extractive, just the facts, the shape of a life, the architecture of a person rendered in the clean, impersonal language of background documentation. Reyes had learned, over 11 years, to deliver exactly what was asked for and nothing more, and he set the folder on Damien's desk without comment and left without being dismissed, which was itself a form of comment. Damien did not open it immediately. He sat at his desk in the study of his penthouse, a room of dark wood and floor, the ceiling windows, and the specific kind of order that belongs to a man who controls his environment because there are other things he cannot control, and looked at the folder with an expression that, had anyone been present to see it, they would not have recognized. It was not his boardroom face. It was not the face he wore in rooms like the gala, where everything was performance and calculation. It was something rawer than those things and considerably less comfortable. He opened the file. Ilara Vance, 26, staff writer, Meridian Courier, degree in journalism from the State University, graduated 3rd in her class. Before that, and here something in him stilled, a childhood defined by the kind of careful, dignified poverty that leaves marks not in behavior but in posture, the way a person carries themselves when they have learned early that there is no safety net. Her father had left when she was 7. Her mother had raised her alone, working 2 jobs, and had died 2 months ago from complications following a cardiac procedure, leaving behind a daughter and a medical debt that was documented here in numbers that Damien read once, set down, and did not read again. He closed the file. He sat for a long time in the dark and the quiet of his study, the city burning its 10,000 lights beyond the glass, and he thought about a woman in a navy dress carrying a notebook like it was the most important thing in the building. He thought about the morning silences in the library reading room, silences that had felt, increasingly, like the most honest conversations he had in any given day, which was not a comfortable thing to recognize about his life. He thought about the specific quality of her steadiness, the way she met everything, his coldness, his silences, his reputation, which she must have been researching even then with that unshakable, almost eerie calm. He thought about the debt, the numbers he had read once and set down. He reached for his phone, he put it back down, he picked it up again. "Rays," he said. "The Bellini file, has our source been contained?" "Yes," Rays said. "Completely. Someone else has the documentation," Damien said, "or will have it soon. I want to know who." I pause. "We already have a lead on that. Tell me." Another pause, this one with a different texture. "Damien." Rays said, the use of his first name rare and deliberate, a signal that what came next mattered. "It's the courier. Gerald Marsh received a package 4 days ago." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes decisions. "And the writer he assigned," Damien said. It was not a question, he already knew. Rays confirmed it anyway. Damien set the phone down on his desk without ending the call. He looked at the closed file. He looked at the city beyond the glass. He thought about her sitting in the library every morning with her notebook and her private shorthand, and the stories she was always writing about people, she'd said, about the things they carry. And he thought about the particular terrible irony of what was now unfolding. He was the story. And she had been sitting across from him every morning, in the quiet that felt like honesty, and the whole time the notebook had been about him. He told himself this was what it was. He told himself the clarity of this fact changed something fundamental. He told himself the morning conversations had been a context he had misread, and that misreading it was a failure of judgment he would not repeat. He told himself all of this with the cold efficiency of a man who has spent his adult life constructing a particular kind of interior fortress, and it worked, and he believed it, and he picked up his phone and said, "I want to meet with Marsh tonight." Gerald Marsh lived in a brownstone on the west side, and he opened his door at 9:45 in the evening to find Damien Voss on his front step, alone, which was somehow more frightening than if he had brought men with him. Gerald was not a coward. He had been in this business for 35 years. He had been threatened by politicians and sued by corporations, and had a brick thrown through his office window once by a man whose corruption he had reported on in meticulous, irrefutable detail. He believed in what he did the way people believe in things they have paid for with real cost, and that belief was not easily rattled. But there was something about Damien Voss standing on his front step at 9:45 at night that rattled it. "Mr. Marsh," Damien said, "invite me in." Gerald invited him in. They sat in his living room, which was full of books and the comfortable disorder of a man who lived alone and had made his peace with it, and Damien looked entirely out of place in it, and somehow, because of that, more dangerous a still point in a warm and human room. "You received documentation," Damien said, 4 days ago, regarding certain financial arrangements involving municipal development funds and several connected entities. Gerald looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to confirm or deny what the courier has or hasn't received. I'm not asking you to confirm it," Damien said. "I'm telling you that I know you have it. I'm telling you that the source who sent it to you has an agenda that has nothing to do with public accountability and everything to do with destabilizing arrangements that currently keep this city functioning in ways that you probably prefer not to think about." He paused. "I'm also telling you that publishing what you have as you have it will not achieve what you hope. It will achieve something else, something that will be worse for this city than what it replaces." Gerald said nothing for a moment. "And you've come here to tell me to kill the story. I've come here to ask you to wait," Damien said. 30 days for what?" "For a restructuring to be completed that will make most of what you have moot. The Bellini arrangement is already being unwound, voluntarily. There are reasons for the way certain things have been managed in this city that I will not explain to you tonight, but I am asking you to trust not me. I understand you have no reason to trust me, but your own instinct that a story published from incomplete information causes damage that cannot be undone." Gerald looked at him for a long moment. "You're more articulate than I expected." Something shifted fractionally in Damien's expression. Most people are, when they're talking about something that matters to them. "And this matters to you, the city." The pause before his answer was very brief, almost imperceptible. "Yes," Damien said, Just that. Gerald sat back in his chair. He looked at the books on his shelves, at the organized disorder of his lived-in life, at the man sitting across from him who was not quite what he had expected and not quite what the documentation suggested, and not quite, Gerald thought, what he was performing as. I have a writer on this story, Gerald said carefully. A good one. I can ask her to wait, but I cannot tell her why, and she will not wait indefinitely. Damien said nothing. She doesn't know about this conversation, Gerald added. It was not exactly a warning. It was something between a warning and a piece of information being deliberately placed. Damien stood. 30 days, Mr. Marsh, he left. Gerald sat alone in his living room with the specific sensation of a man who has just had a conversation he will be thinking about for the rest of his career, and possibly the rest of his life. He did not call Elara that night. He told himself it was because it was late. Elara was back at the library the following morning. She arrived at 7:25, 5 minutes earlier than usual, and found the reading room empty and sat at her table and opened her notebook and wrote nothing for 4 minutes, which for her was an eternity. She was thinking about the documentation. She had spent the past 2 weeks building the story in careful layers, source verification, cross-referencing, the patient cartography of financial wrongdoing that required precision and time and the particular kind of tolerance for uncertainty that she had developed specifically because it did not come naturally to her. She was close. She could feel the closeness of it, the way a story announces itself when it is nearly complete. A kind of narrative pressure that builds behind the facts until they are ready to speak clearly. She was also in a separate and uncomfortable compartment of her mind, thinking about the mornings in this room, about the conversations that weren't quite conversations, about the way the silence had changed over 2 weeks from something guarded to something else, something that felt, if she was honest with herself, like recognition. Like two people discovering they were speaking the same language in a country where neither of them had expected to find it spoken. She was a journalist. She understood the problem this created. She had been studying him as a subject while simultaneously, in some other register she hadn't consented to, experiencing him as a person. These two things were incompatible. She knew this. She had known it for days and had been managing the knowledge the way she managed other uncomfortable truths, by keeping it in its compartment and not opening the compartment door in the morning. The door of the reading room opened. He came in at 7:31, which was his usual time. He did not look at her differently than he had on any other morning. He sat down at his table. He opened his book. She watched him for exactly 2 seconds before she looked back at her notebook. The room settled into its usual frequency, the soft presence of two people in a shared silence, the occasional sound of a page turning, the gray October light moving slowly across the long tables. She had decided, before he arrived, that she was going to tell him. Not about the story. She could not tell him about the story. That was an ethical line she would not cross. But about the fact that she knew who he was, the full version of who he was. She had been sitting across from him every morning, allowing him to believe she was simply a journalist who happened to frequent the same library. And there was something in the dishonesty of this that was becoming intolerable in a way she hadn't expected. She was a person who believed in saying the true thing, even when the true thing was costly. It was possibly the most important belief she had. She had decided she would tell him. She had also not decided, because she was genuinely uncertain, whether telling him was the right thing or the brave thing or merely the thing she wanted to do because sitting across from him in gray morning light and writing about his world in her private shorthand had become a weight she was tired of carrying alone. She opened her mouth. "You know," he said without looking up from his book. She closed it. The silence that followed was different from any silence they had shared in this room. It was not the soft, negotiated quiet of two people choosing peace. It was the silence after a blade falls, precise, complete, irreversible. He turned a page, then he closed the book. He looked at her. His eyes were the color she had written about in the margin of her notebook and then covered with her hand, and they were completely still, and in them she could see nothing that told her how long he had known, or what he intended, or what this moment was going to cost. How long? She asked. Her voice was level. She was proud of this. Does it matter? Yes. He considered this 4 days, 4 days. She did the calculation. 4 days ago, she had been on her kitchen floor with her notebook in her lap at midnight, resolving a billing dispute. 4 days ago, he had sat in this room and read 4 pages and absorbed none of them, and then gone home and made a phone call. You had me investigated, she said. Yes. The single syllable, undefended and unadorned, she had expected deflection. She had expected the particular, rhetorical sophistication of a man accustomed to never being cornered. The plainness of it, the simple, unapologetic yes, caught her somewhere she hadn't prepared. And now, she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Now? He said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard there before. Not warmth exactly, but the pressure that exists just before warmth, the moment before a held thing is released. I'm sitting in a library at 7 in the morning, which I haven't done since I was 19, and I'm finding I'm not ready to stop. She looked at him. The morning light moved across the table between them. The story isn't going away, she said quietly. It was not a threat. It was the truest thing she could offer him. I want you to know that. I know that, he said. Then, what are we doing here? The question landed in the silence between them and sat there, breathing. He picked up his book. He opened it to the page he had closed. I don't know, he said. And the honesty in those 3 words, the raw, unguarded honesty of them, from a man for whom honesty was clearly not a habit, hit her somewhere deep and undefended, and she looked down at her notebook and pressed her pen to the page and did not write a single word. They sat until 8:15, when the library officially opened and the first other patrons began to arrive, and neither of them spoke again. When she stood to leave, he did not stop her. When she reached the door, she paused. She turned back. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her, she understood, since the moment she stood up, waiting with that stillness of his, that terrible, infinite patience. Tomorrow, she said. It was not an invitation. It was not quite a question. It existed in the space between those things. His eyes held hers across the length of the reading room. Tomorrow, he said. She left. The door closed behind her. And Damien Voss sat alone in the reading room of the Meridian City Library, with his book open in his hands and his eyes on the closed door, and something moving beneath the surface of his face that no one in this city would have recognized, and that he himself had not felt in so long. He had almost convinced himself it was gone. It was not gone, it had only been waiting. The restructuring Damien had mentioned to Gerald Marsh was real. This was the thing about Damien Voss that the documentation Alara had been building her story on could not fully capture. The thing that lived in the space between the facts, in the gap between what he was and what people assumed he was. The arrangements that the anonymous source had exposed were real. The municipal fund redirections were real. The shell structures and the subsidiary accounts and the carefully engineered invisibility of it all real, real, real. She was not wrong about any of it, but the documentation had been assembled by someone who wanted to tell a specific story, and specific stories, Alara knew better than most, were not the same thing as true ones. They were true stories with the inconvenient parts removed. What the documentation did not contain was this. 3 years ago, the city's eastern district had been on the verge of a different kind of collapse. Not financial, structural. The kind that happens when the legitimate channels of power are so thoroughly corrupted that nothing moves through them anymore, and the people who suffer are the ones who always suffer, the ones who cannot leave, who have nowhere else to go, who depend on systems that have quietly stopped caring about them. Gerald Marsh had been right that the city's infrastructure money had been moving through channels it wasn't supposed to move through. What the documentation obscured was where it had been moving to. Damien had not set out to be this. He had inherited a structure he had spent 12 years trying, with limited and partial success, to transform from the inside, an impossible project, a Sisyphean renovation of something that perhaps could not be renovated, only dismantled, and dismantlement had its own casualties. He had made decisions he could not defend cleanly. He had operated in a moral vocabulary that was not the one he would have chosen if he had been given the luxury of choosing. He understood that from the outside, from the vantage of a person with a notebook and an instinct for true things, he looked like exactly what the documentation suggested. He had sat in the library every morning and watched her write and known on some level that what she was writing was him, the version of him that the evidence supported, the version that was real and incomplete simultaneously, and he had said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would not sound like exactly the kind of thing a man in his position would say. Every defense became an accusation against itself. Every explanation carried the shape of manipulation. So he had said nothing. He had sat in the quiet and read 4 pages of a book he barely absorbed and let the mornings be what they were, the cleanest thing in his life, which was not a small thing, even if it was also a doomed one. 4 days after his visit to Gerald Marsh, Reyes came to him with information that changed the temperature of everything. The source, Reyes said. He set a second folder on Damien's desk, thinner than the first, but with a particular weight to it that had nothing to do with its physical mass. "We know who it is." Damien looked at it without touching it. "Tell me, Vincent Kara," Reyes said. "He ran the Eastern District operations from 2019 to 2021. You cut him out when you restructured the channel agreements. He's been building this package for 18 months. Damien was quiet for a moment. "Kara," he repeated, with the flatness of a man confirming something he had suspected and hoped was wrong. "He didn't just send it to the courier," Reyes said. "He sent it to 3 other outlets. 2 of them have already been managed. The courier is the last one." He paused. "And Kara has a second package, a more personal one, designed specifically for if the first one gets suppressed. What's in it?" Reyes told him. The silence that followed was long and of a specific quality. The silence of a man sitting very still while something reorganizes itself inside him. Damien's hand rested flat on his desk. He looked at the city through the glass. When he spoke, his voice was level, but Reyes, who had known him for 11 years, heard the thing beneath the level. "The second package," Damien said. "What's the trigger?" "Publication of the first story is suppressed for more than 30 days. He has a contact at the courier, a junior staff member, we think, not the writer, who's monitoring progress. If the story stalls, the second package goes out automatically." "To who?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. "To her," he said. "To Vance directly." The flat hand on the desk pressed slightly harder against the surface. "Just slightly." "Just once. What does the second package contain?" Damien asked, and his voice was completely, precisely controlled, which in Reyes's experience meant the opposite of what it sounded like. "Financial records, real ones, not the curated version, and personal material." Reyes paused. "Your sister, Damien, the agreement you made with the Messina family in 2018 to keep her safe, all of it." The room was very quiet. Damien's sister was 22 years old and lived in another country under a different name, and had, since the age of 17, been the only thing in his life that he would describe, if asked and if honest, as irreplaceable. She knew what her brother was. She had grown up in it. She had left not in anger, but in the quiet, sorrowing way of a person who understands that the safest thing they can do for the people they love is to remove themselves from the range of what might hurt them. He had let her go. He had arranged her safety with the meticulous care he applied to everything that mattered to him. He had not seen her in 14 months. Her safety depended on no one knowing where she was. If Kara's package reached Alara, if Alara published it, the people who needed to not know where his sister was would know within 48 hours. "He's using her," Damien said quietly, precisely. "Kara is using the story to get to Sofia." "Yes," Reyes said. Damien stood up from his desk. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, looking at the city that he had spent 12 years maintaining in its complicated, morally ambiguous equilibrium. And he thought about a journalist with a notebook who believed in saying the true thing even when it cost her. And he thought about his sister's face the last time he had seen it at an airport 14 months ago. her hand briefly on his arm, her eyes saying what neither of them put into words. Options, he said. We can approach Vance directly, Reyes said. Tell her about Sophia. Ask her to. No. The word was immediate and absolute. Reyes waited. She will not be put in the position of choosing between a story and someone's safety. Damien said, still facing the window. That is not a choice she should have to make. That is not something I will do to her. Then the second option is Kara, Reyes said. We find him, and we remove the trigger entirely before the 30 days expire. Find him, Damien said. Quietly, I want no collateral. He turned from the window. His face was composed now, the boardroom face, the penthouse face. The face that the city knew and that Reyes knew was the most dangerous one precisely because of how still it was. And Reyes the story, tell Marsh the 30-day arrangement is changed. Reyes looked at him carefully. Changed how? Tell him to let it run. Damien said, whenever his writer is ready, I won't suppress it. Reyes said nothing for a moment. The Bellini exposure will. I know what it will cost. Damien said, tell him anyway. He sat back down at his desk. He opened a different folder and began to read, which was the signal that the conversation was over. Reyes picked up the file and moved toward the door. Damien, he said, pausing at the threshold. Damien did not look up. You should tell her, Reyes said, not about the story, not about Kara, about the thing that Reyes, who had known him for 11 years and had perhaps one real conversation with him in all of that time, had noticed accumulating in the margins of his employer's carefully ordered life. Whatever it is, you should tell her. Damien turned a page. Go find Kara, he said. Reyes went. Elira arrived at the library the next morning to find an envelope on the table. Her table. The one she had occupied every morning for 3 years. In the corner by the window where the light came in at the right angle for reading without straining. The envelope was plain, white, unmarked. It had been placed precisely in the center of the table, not left casually, not slipped under something, but placed deliberately, the way you place something you want to be found. Inside was a single index card. On it, in handwriting she did not recognize, precise and slightly angular, the handwriting of a man who wrote rarely and carefully, were 3 words. Don't come tomorrow. She read it twice. She turned the card over, as if there might be something on the back. There wasn't. She sat down slowly in her usual chair and held the card in both hands and looked at it with the particular focused attention of a person who is being very careful not to feel the thing they are feeling. She felt it anyway. It was not fear. She knew fear, had lived adjacent to it long enough to recognize its specific texture. This was something different. It was the sensation of a door closing in a room she hadn't realized she'd been standing in, and the specific, disproportionate weight of that, the way it settled in her chest like something physical, something with mass and edges. She put the card in her notebook. She sat in the reading room for an hour, alone, in the gray morning quiet. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write. Not about the story, not her notes, not her shorthand cartography of financial wrongdoing. Something else. Something she had been writing in fragments for weeks, in the margins and the spaces between her reporting. In the private register she kept for things that did not belong anywhere except the page. She wrote about the mornings. She wrote about the silence that had changed. She wrote about a man who had asked her what she was writing with the genuine, unguarded curiosity of someone who had forgotten to be careful. She wrote about the specific quality of being seen by someone who was not supposed to see you, who saw you anyway, who looked at a notebook and a navy dress and something behind your eyes and registered it as real, as worth registering, in a world where his default mode of looking was through rather than at. She wrote until the page was full. Then she turned to a clean page and wrote, why the warning, what changed? She had 3 answers, lined up in order of how much she wanted them to be true. She examined each one. She dismissed the first one, which was the kindest. She sat for a long time with the second one, which was the most logical. She refused, for now, to look directly at the third one, the one that lived in the part of her that had put his handwriting in her notebook rather than in the bin. She stood up. She put on her coat. She picked up her notebook and her bag. She did not go home. She went to the address that had been in the background documentation. The one she had been building her story around for 3 weeks. Not to confront, not to report, not to do anything she could justify professionally. She went because she was a person who believed in the direct approach, and because something had changed overnight and she did not know what it was, and because the not knowing was intolerable in a way that had become impossible to manage. She went to find out the true thing. The building was not what she had expected. She had expected glass and steel, a monument to controlled power, security that would stop her in the lobby without explanation. What she found was a building that was those things. Yes, the lobby was marble and the security was present and professional. But it was also, somehow, quieter than she had imagined. The lobby had a quality of stillness that reminded her, absurdly, of the library, as if the space had been arranged specifically to minimize noise, as if whoever lived here valued silence the way other people valued light. The security man at the desk looked at her with the particular professional neutrality of a person who has been instructed to expect unexpected arrivals. "Ilara Vance," she said, "I don't have an appointment." The man looked at her for a moment, then he picked up a phone. He said something she couldn't hear. He listened. He set the phone down. 42nd floor, he said, and gestured to the elevators. She rode up alone. The elevator was silent and fast, and when the doors opened, she stepped out into a corridor that was dim and quiet. The city laid out in every direction through floor, a ceiling glass, and Damien Voss was standing at the far end of it, watching her arrive. He was in dark trousers and a dark shirt, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbows. It was the most undone she had ever seen him, and something about it, the simple human fact of it, the visible forearms and the absence of armor, made him look less like the version she had been building in her notes and more like the version she had been trying not to think about. He watched her walk toward him and said nothing. She stopped 6 feet away. "I got your card," she said. "I know. I want to know why." He looked at her steadily. "Ilara." It was the first time he had used her name. Not M.S. Vance, her name, her actual name. The one he had asked her for at the gala, and then held somewhere private inside himself for weeks. The way he said it was not gentle exactly. It was too careful for gentle, too deliberate. But there was something in it that made the 6 feet between them feel like a much larger distance than it was. "Something has changed," she said. "Something happened that made you want me away from the library, from you, and I need to know what it is." "You don't," he said. Quietly, "I do. Knowing it will not help you. It will only add weight to something you are already carrying enough of." She went very still. The words landed in a precise place, the specific place that a person who has read your file knows to aim for, and that a person who has been paying attention knows to aim for, and she could not tell which of those things he was doing, and was not sure, in this moment, that the difference mattered. "Don't do that," she said, and there was something in her voice she hadn't intended, something that had gotten past the management, that had come from the kitchen floor at midnight, from the notebook in her lap. "From the 2 years of carrying the thing alone, don't make decisions for me about what I can hold." The silence between them was absolute. He looked at her for a long moment, the longest, most unguarded look she had ever received from him. The kind of look that a man gives when he has stopped calculating and is simply, nakedly looking. She felt it the way you feel a change in weather. Not a single sensation, but a shift in everything at once. His hand moved, just slightly, toward her. It stopped before it completed the motion, caught by something invisible and internal, and returned to his side. But she had seen it. And in seeing it, she understood, with the part of her that was not a journalist and had no professional distance and could not be managed or compartmentalized, that she was in serious trouble. Not the kind with documentation, the other kind. The kind that does not resolve cleanly and does not leave the body when the story ends and has no shorthand, private or otherwise, for what it costs. She looked at his hand at his side. She looked at his face. She took one step forward, which was the bravest thing she had done in a very long time. The next 4 hours were the most honest of his life. He understood this while they were happening, not in retrospect, not with the clean clarity of distance, but in the immediate, uncomfortable present tense of it. They moved through his penthouse like two people who had known each other's rhythms for years rather than weeks, which was impossible and also, undeniably, true. She was on her phone in the study while he was on his in the corridor, and the murmur of her voice, precise, authoritative, completely unintimidated by whoever was on the other end, moved through the quiet of the space like something that had always belonged there. He caught himself listening for it when it stopped. Reyes called back at 11:43. The trace was confirmed. A scheduled digital send, server-based, set to release Kara's second package at midnight if not intercepted. Illyra's contact at the Federal Registry had flagged the originating server within the window. 37 minutes to spare. Not comfortable, not the kind of margin that allowed for relief, only for the focused, sustained effort of people who understand that the distance between almost and enough is everything. At 11:59, Reyes sent a single word, done. Illyra was standing at the window when Damien showed her the message. She read it, she let out a breath, slow, controlled, the breath of a person releasing something they have been holding at considerable cost. She did not perform the relief. She simply had it quietly, the way she had everything, as if her interior life was a room she kept orderly and private and occasionally, in specific circumstances, allowed someone to see the inside of. He watched her breathe. He thought about Sophia, on the other side of the world, asleep in the place where she was safe, and did not know how close the safety had come to breaking tonight. He would call her tomorrow. He would not tell her what had happened. He would simply call, which he did not do often enough, and listen to her voice, and she would ask him if he was all right with the particular precision of a sister who has always been able to heal the thing beneath the thing, and he would say yes, and it would be, for perhaps the first time in a long time, true. He looked at Illyra. "Thank you," he said. She turned from the window. The city behind her was a field of light, continuous and vast, the kind of backdrop that makes individuals look small and somehow more significant for it. She looked at him across the room, and she was not small. She was exactly her size, which was considerable, which had been considerable from the moment she had crouched down in a marble hallway and picked up her notebook without apology. "Don't," she said, but gently. The way you say something gently when you mean the gentleness as much as the word. "Don't thank you. Don't make it a transaction," she said. "It wasn't." He held her eyes. "No," he said. "It wasn't?" The night had thinned to something quiet around them, the specific quiet of past midnight, when the city's noise drops to its essential register, and the silence between sounds becomes audible. They were both tired in the way that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from the particular cost of an evening that had required the full, unguarded weight of themselves. He moved toward her, not quickly. There was nothing rushed about it. It had the quality of something inevitable, of a direction that had been established weeks ago in a marble hallway and had been traveled toward steadily, unhurriedly ever since. He stopped in front of her. "The story," he said, "will be true," she said. "All of it, I know." He looked at her face, at the exhaustion in it, at the steadiness beneath the exhaustion, at the thing she had been carrying for 2 years that lived in the particular set of her jaw and the careful straightness of her spine. "I know it will. It will cost you," she said. Not a warning, a fact offered plainly, between two people who had agreed to deal in facts. "Some things are worth their cost," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Your grandfather built something broken. Your father refined it. You have spent 12 years trying to rebuild it from the inside. That is the true story, Damien. Whole one, not the one Kara assembled, and not the one you would prefer, the whole one, with all its damage and all its genuine attempt. That is what the city is going to read." He was quiet for a long moment. "They will not be kind to it," he said. "No," she agreed, "but they will understand it, and understanding is worth more than kindness. You know that." He did know that. He had always known that. It was possibly the truest thing anyone had said to him in years, and it had been said by a woman in a navy dress who had walked into his chest in a marble hallway and looked at him without fear, and then written about him in a private shorthand while sitting 3 tables away every morning, and then crossed a room and put her hand against his face like it was the most natural thing, the most necessary thing, the only right response to the situation. He reached out and touched her face the way she had touched his. His hand was careful. It held the specific carefulness of a man who does not touch things lightly because he understands that touching means something, that the gesture carries weight, that once it is made, it cannot be taken back, and he does not want to take it back. His thumb moved across her cheek, and she leaned into it, barely the smallest degree of lean, but real, undeniable, the kind of movement a person makes when they have been holding themselves upright alone for a very long time and have found, without planning to, something solid enough to lean toward. "What happens now?" she said. It was barely a whisper. "I don't know," he said. And the honesty of it, the clean, unprecedented honesty of a man who had spent his entire adult life knowing, calculating, controlling, was the most intimate thing he had offered her. More intimate than his hand on her face, more intimate than anything. "I genuinely don't know, and I find that I'm not afraid of it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to write the story," she said, "and you're going to read it, and it's going to be hard for both of us." And then she stopped. "And then," he said, not a question, an agreement, a door left open. She stepped back gently, and he let his hand fall, and they stood in the quiet of the penthouse above the city, with the weight of the evening between them, and around them and inside them. And neither of them reached for more than what was there, because what was there was already enormous, already more than either of them had been holding when the night began. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he said. She picked up her notebook from the table where she had set it. She put on her coat. She moved toward the door with the particular unhurried pace of a person who is leaving because the time is right and not because they want to. At the door, she stopped. She turned. He was standing exactly where she had left him, watching her go with an expression that was not his boardroom face or his penthouse face or the face the city knew. It was a face she did not have a name for yet. She would need more time, more mornings, more silences to name it accurately, but she recognized it. She recognized it, the way you recognize a room you have been in before without knowing when. "The library," she said. He said nothing. He waited. "Tomorrow," she said. 7:30. The pause before he answered was the length of a single breath. 7:30, he said. She nodded once. She opened the door. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood in the corridor with the city visible through the glass on every side. The enormous, indifferent, complicated city, which was the same city it had always been, but looked, tonight, from this height, after this evening, like something she was seeing clearly for the first time. The elevator opened. She stepped in. As the doors began to close, she opened her notebook to the margin note she had written in the first week and covered with her hand, and looked at it for a moment in the private shorthand that no one else could read. Then she wrote 3 more words beneath it. The doors closed. He stood at the window for a long time after she left. The city moved below him, its sirens and its lights and its 10,000 private stories, all of them happening simultaneously, none of them aware of the others, each one convinced of its own singularity. He had looked at this city from this window for 6 years, and it had always looked like a system to him, a mechanism, a thing to be understood and managed and maintained. A clock whose gears he had memorized. Tonight it looked like something else. It looked like a place where things happened that you did not plan, where a woman walked into your chest in a marble hallway and picked up her notebook and looked at you without fear. And you spent 3 weeks sitting in a library pretending to read, and somewhere in the pretending it became real, and the real thing was inconvenient and complicated and arrived at the worst possible time in the worst possible configuration, and was nonetheless exactly itself, unmistakable, undeniable, the kind of thing that does not ask for permission and does not wait for the right moment because it understands, with the animal certainty of true things, that there is no right moment, there is only the moment that exists, and whether or not you are honest enough to be in it. He picked up his phone. He thought about calling Sophia. He decided tomorrow. He thought about calling Ray's. He decided morning. He set the phone down. He went to his desk and opened the drawer where he kept, among the ordered tools of his working life, a single thing that was not a tool, a small, worn notebook, barely used, that he had carried for years and written almost nothing in. He opened it to the first blank page. He sat for a long time. Then he picked up a pen. He wrote one line. He did not cover it with his hand. The story ran on a Thursday, 6 days later. It was the most important piece of journalism the Meridian Courier had published in 11 years, and Gerald Marsh knew it from the moment. Alara placed the final draft on his desk and stood back and let him read it in silence. He read it twice. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man who hired a journalist 4 years ago because she had the instinct, and has spent 4 years watching it become something he does not have a word for adequate enough. "This is going to change things," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's the point. The story told the truth. The whole truth, Bellini, the fund redirections, the shell structures, the architecture of it. And beneath that, in the same unflinching precision, the Eastern District. The schools that had been repaired with money, that had moved through channels it was not supposed to move through. The community center on Faro Street, the water infrastructure in the lower wards. The money that had been redirected, yes, and where it had actually landed, which was not in anyone's private account, which was in the bones of a part of the city that the legitimate channels had been quietly starving for years. It told the truth about Damien Voss. Not the version that protected him and not the version that destroyed him, the true version, which was more complex and more damning and more human than either of those, which was the version that a city deserved and that a journalist who believed in real things was obligated to provide. She did not write about the library. She did not write about his sister, or the card on the table, or a hand held against a face in a quiet room above the city. Those things were true, but they belonged to her, to the private register, the margin notes, the shorthand that no one else could read. The public story and the private one were not the same story, and she understood the difference in the way she understood everything, completely and at some cost. The response was immediate and substantial and complicated in exactly the way she had predicted. Bellini resigned within 48 hours. 3 city council members called for a formal investigation. 2 newspapers ran editorials that praised the reporting. One ran an editorial that questioned her methods, which she read carefully, considered seriously, and filed. Damien Voss released a statement through his legal team. It acknowledged the financial irregularities. It confirmed the Eastern District investments. It said nothing that was not true, and nothing that was not measured, and it was written in a voice that was. She would have recognized it anywhere his. She read it at her desk on a Friday morning, with her notebook open beside her and her cold coffee untouched. She did not know what came next. This was unusual for her. She was a person who always knew broadly what came next. She was a person of notebooks and plans, and the patient architecture of things built carefully. But she had sat across from a man for 3 weeks in a reading room and found something she did not have a plan for, and the story was out now, and the 30 days were over, and the thing that existed between them existed in the territory that had no map. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the margin note, the one she had written in the first week, and covered with her hand, and the 3 words she had written beneath it in the elevator, in the moment before the doors closed. She read both. She closed the notebook. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and walked out of the courier's offices into the October morning, which was gray and cold and sharp with the particular clarity of a day that has decided to be honest about itself. She walked 6 blocks. She pushed open the door of the Meridian City Library. She nodded to the building manager, who let her through before the official opening, the way he had done for 3 years. She walked into the reading room. He was already there. Of course he was. He was sitting at his table, not his table, they did not have tables, but the table he had always sat at, which was his in the way that things become yours when you return to them enough times. He had a book open in front of him that she was almost certain he was not reading. He looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it had been doing for weeks in this room. That almost imperceptible shift, that change in pressure, the wall not gone but changed, reform, into something permeable, something that let light move through it in both directions. She sat at her table. She opened her notebook. The morning quiet settled around them, the gray light, the smell of old paper, the particular frequency of a silence that two people have been building together long enough that it has become its own kind of language. After a while, without looking up from his book, he said, "The statement." "I read it," she said. "Was it?" "It was true," she said, "all of it." He turned a page. She wrote something in her notebook. The silence continued. It was the good kind, the kind that does not need to be filled because it is already full of everything that has been said and everything that has not been said, and the specific weight of two people who have chosen, without announcing it, to keep returning to the same quiet room. Outside, the city was beginning its day. The noise of it rose and fell beyond the library walls, horns and voices, and the machinery of 10,000 ordinary mornings, each one unremarkable from the outside, each one containing, inside it, something irreplaceable. She turned to a new page in her notebook. At the top, in her private shorthand, she wrote a question, the same question she had been writing in various forms for weeks, the one that lived beneath the story and beneath the margin notes and beneath the 3 words in the elevator. The question that did not yet have an answer and might not for a long time, and that she realized, prepared to sit with in the quiet of a library reading room for however long it took. He looked up from his book. His eyes found hers across the long table. Something in them was asking the same question. Neither of them spoke. The morning light moved across the floor between them, slow and gray and full of promise, and the story was out in the world now, doing what true stories do, and whatever came after it was still unwritten, still open, still breathing a page without words yet, which is not an ending but the most honest kind of beginning, the kind that arrives without announcement and asks only that you be present enough to recognize it. She looked at him, he looked at her. Outside, the city went on. He did not step back. This was the thing she noticed first, that he held his ground, that he did not retreat into the particular emotional distance he had maintained for weeks, like a physical territory with borders and guards. He stood exactly where he was and let her step toward him and the air between them, reduced now to something measurable, something that could be crossed in a single breath, changed in a way that neither of them acknowledged and both of them felt in the same place, low in the chest, were the things you cannot argue yourself out of life. "Tell me," she said, quietly, not a demand. Something closer to a plea, which cost her, because she did not plead easily, and he knew this about her now, in the way that a person knows things about another person when they have sat across from them in the gray morning light long enough to learn the shape of their silences. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the window. She followed, because there was nothing else to do, because the alternative was standing in a corridor feeling the absence of him like a barometric drop, and she had passed the point where the professional and the personal occupied different rooms. They stood side by side at the floor, the ceiling glass, the city spread out below them in its enormous, indifferent complexity, and he was quiet for long enough that she thought he had decided not to speak after all. "My sister's name is Sophia," he said. She turned to look at him. His profile was toward her, jaw set, eyes on the city, the specific stillness of a man choosing each word from a limited supply. "She's 22. She lives somewhere safe. The only reason she is safe is because no one knows where that is, no one outside of 2 people who have kept that information for 4 years without breaking." He paused. "3 days ago, I learned that the man who sent your editor the documentation, the source, has assembled a second package, a more complete one. It contains information about the arrangement I made to keep Sophia safe, the people from whom she needs to be safe." He stopped. "If that information is published, she has 48 hours before it reaches the wrong people." Alara was very still. "The second package is triggered automatically." He continued, "If the first story is suppressed beyond 30 days. Kara, the source, built it as insurance, a failsafe. He is using your story to get to her, and there is nothing I can do about the trigger without finding him first, which is happening, but which requires time I may not have." The city glittered below them. A siren moved through the distance, faint and wailing, and faded. "I sent the card," he said, "because I did not want you near the library while this was unresolved. I did not want you near me." He stopped again, not because of the story, because of what Kara will assume about you if he watches me closely enough, because of what that assumption might cost you. She understood. She understood all of it, the card, the 30 days, the visit to Gerald, the entire careful architecture of protection that he had been building around people while simultaneously making it impossible for her to see it. She understood it, and it was almost too much to hold at once the scale of it. The specific way it confirmed and complicated everything she had been building in her notebook for weeks. "You were protecting me," she said. The words were very quiet. "I was attempting to." He said, "It's possible the attempt was clumsy." Something moved through her, a wave of something she could not name cleanly, that had components of anger and relief, and a tenderness so unexpected and fierce that it frightened her. She looked at his profile. She looked at the jaw and the stillness and the hands clasped behind his back with the particular rigidity of a man holding himself very carefully together. "You should have told me," she said. "You would have made a different choice. That was mine to make." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were close and direct and full of something she had been watching approach for weeks from a great distance, and was now standing directly in front of. And the thing in his eyes was not cold, had perhaps never been cold, had been controlled, contained, managed with the same discipline he applied to everything, but it was not cold, and it never had been, and she had known this, she realized, since a man had looked at her notebook in a marble hallway and registered it as something real. "Yes," he said, "it was." The admission settled between them, simple and irrevocable. "Sophia," Alara said. "Tell me about her." Something in his face shifted the smallest, most significant movement. It was not the hairline crack she had been watching for weeks. It was the crack opening, the wall finally, after everything, admitting that it was a wall. She used to leave notes everywhere. He said, and his voice was different, lower, with something unguarded in it that she had heard approaching for weeks and was now hearing fully, for the first time, without any glass between them. In books, in jacket pockets, on the backs of receipts. She said writing things down was the only way to make them real. I used to find them for months after she left, small ones, behind a picture frame, inside a coffee cup I never used. He stopped. He looked at Alara's notebook, which she was holding against her chest the way she always held it. "She would have liked you," he said. "She would have said you were the same kind of person." The silence that followed this was the deepest they had ever shared. Deeper than the library mornings. Deeper than the marble hallway. It was a silence that contained something new, something that had not existed before this moment, and could not be put back once it had been spoken into being. Alara's hand moved to the notebook. She held it for a moment. Then she held it out toward him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You can write it," she said. "The parts about you. I think you should." He did not take it immediately. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they want, and are afraid of wanting in the same moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it from her hands. He opened it. He found his name, written in her private shorthand but legible in this context, surrounded by the architecture of her investigation, the careful network of connections and questions she had been building for weeks. He read. She watched his face while he read, not for vulnerability, not to use it, but because this was a moment that was happening, and she was a person who believed in being present for the things that mattered, even the ones that frightened her. He read for a long time. His face gave very little. She had learned by now to read the things it gave. He found the margin note, the one she had written in the first week and covered with her hand, the one in her private shorthand. He looked at it for a moment. "What does this say?" he said, quietly, not a question exactly, something that lived in the space between knowing and asking. She looked at the margin. She looked at his face. "It says," she said, and her voice was steady, and it cost her to keep it steady, "that you looked at my notebook instead of at me, and that something about that felt like being seen more accurately than I had been seen in a very long time." The room was entirely silent. He closed the notebook. He held it for a moment with both hands, the way she always held it, and then he held it back out to her, and when she took it, their fingers were briefly in the same space, and neither of them moved. To end that for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, he stepped back. "The story," he said. His voice had returned to its controlled register, but the control was different now, not the fortress wall, but something more like a person choosing their words because they mean them. "I'm not going to ask you to kill it. I'm not going to ask you to wait or soften it or shape it around my interests. What you have is real, most of it is true. Publish it." She stared at him. "If the first story publishes, Kara's trigger, Ray's is close," he said. "He will find him before it matters. And if he doesn't," he looked at her directly, "then Sophia and I will manage what comes. We have managed things before." He paused. "Your story is real, Elara. The city deserves to read a real thing. That is worth more than my comfort with the outcome." She felt the tenderness again, the fierce, frightening wave of it. And this time she did not try to name it or manage it or place it in a compartment. She let it be what it was. She had been managing things for 2 years in the kitchen of her life, alone and competent and utterly without rest. And she was tired of managing the things that deserved to simply be felt. "I'm going to write a true story," she said. "Not a partial one, not the one your source built. A true one which includes the Eastern District, which includes what the money actually built, which includes the fact that someone has been trying to do something real inside something that is broken, even if the method, don't protect me," he said sharply. The sharpness was the first raised note she had ever heard from him, and it landed in the room like something thrown. "Do not shape the story to protect me. I will not have that." She met the sharpness without flinching. "I'm not protecting you," she said with a quiet force that matched his. "I'm telling the truth, the whole truth. That is not the same thing. If you cannot tell the difference between protection and accuracy, then you have been protected too rarely and manipulated too often, and I'm sorry for it, but it does not change what I'm going to write." The silence after this was electric. It crackled with the specific energy of two people who are fully present with each other for the first time, without glass, without performance, without the careful distances they have each constructed and maintained. Two people standing in the full force of each other, which is an overwhelming thing to withstand. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on her face. He was breathing slightly harder than usual, barely perceptible, and she perceived it. "You are," he said, and stopped. "What?" she said. He shook his head once, and the expression on his face was something she had no word for, not in her private shorthand, not in the language she used for the things she found in people beneath surface things. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that a wall he built to keep things out has, in the process, been keeping something in. "Elara," he said. It was just her name, but the way he said it this time was different from the corridor. It was not careful, not deliberate, not placed with precision. It was just her name, said by a man who needed to say something, and had run out of everything except that. She crossed the remaining distance between them. She put her hand against his jaw, the carved, cold, marble jaw that had never, in her imagination of this moment, which she had carefully not been having, been this warm, and she felt his whole body go very still, the way the library went still when he walked in, that same quality of air changing, of something fundamental rearranging around a single point. His hand came up and covered hers, not moving it, not pulling it away, just covering it, his fingers curving over hers, holding her hand against his face with the careful, terrified gentleness of someone handling something they are afraid to break. They stood like that, no kiss, no declaration, just the extraordinary, shattering simplicity of a hand held against a face in a quiet room above a city that went on not knowing. His eyes closed, just briefly, just for the duration of a single breath. When they opened, they were wet. She saw it, she said nothing. She did not look away, and she did not pretend she hadn't seen, and she did not release his hand. She simply stayed in the full presence of the thing that was happening, the thing that had been building for weeks in morning silences and loaded conversations, and the particular gravity of two people who had found in each other's company something they had stopped expecting to find. His thumb moved across her knuckles. Once, then his phone rang. The sound was brutal in the silence. a wrong note in a piece of music that had been, for one suspended moment, perfect. He did not move immediately. His eyes stayed on her face for 3 more seconds. 3 seconds in which something enormous passed between them without language, without touch, without anything except the specific and irrevocable knowledge of it. Then he reached for the phone. "Raise," he said. His voice was wrecked. Barely wrecked, but she heard it. She watched his face while he listened. She watched the expression change, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, tectonic inevitability of a man receiving news he has been dreading and has nonetheless prepared for. "Where," he said. He listened. How long ago? He listened. The hand that had covered hers was now at his side. His jaw was set again. The wall was not back, not entirely, not the full fortress, but the softness had retreated to somewhere deeper, somewhere safer, and what had replaced it was the cold efficiency of a man who had learned that tender moments are luxuries with time limits. He lowered the phone. He looked at her. "Kara," he said. "He's moved. He's activated the trigger." The word landed between them like a stone into still water, the rings spreading outward in every direction, touching everything. Sophia Alara said, "She has hours." He said, "Maybe less." What happened next was not what he expected. He expected her to step back. He expected the journalist to reassemble around the person, the professional distance to return, the notebook to open, the story to reposition itself between them the way it had been positioned for weeks. He expected this because it was reasonable, and because he had no right to expect anything else, and because he had been building his expectations low for long enough that he had forgotten they could be exceeded. She did not step back, call Ray's back. She said, "Tell him everything he needs. I'm going to make a call of my own." She was already opening her notebook, already moving, already doing the thing she did, finding the live wire of a situation and following it to its source. "I have a contact at the Federal Communications Registry. If Kara is moving and he's activated a digital trigger, there will be a trace, a server, a scheduled send something. It can be intercepted if we move in the next 40 minutes. He stared at her. "I'm not doing this for the story," she said, looking up from the notebook, and her eyes were direct and clear and completely certain. "I'm doing this because Sophia is 22, and she leaves notes in jacket pockets, and that matters more than any story I will ever write." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Damien Voss, who did not ask for help, who did not accept it, who had not allowed another person to stand beside him in the actual architecture of his life in longer than he could accurately name, said, "Make the call."